She squeezed my hand under the table. Just once. Just enough. My daughter had never done that before. Not at dinner. Not with him sitting right there, smiling at me across the roast chicken like he was already family. His name was Thaddeus. Thad, he kept telling me to call him. Call me Thad, sir. Everyone does. He had one of those easy smiles that arrives before the words do. The kind you see on car salesmen and certain politicians. My wife, Lorraine, was passing him the gravy and laughing at something he'd said about a hockey game. She liked him. She'd told me so 3 times in the 2 weeks since our daughter brought him home. I wanted to like him too. I genuinely did. But my daughter squeezed my hand, and then she let go, and I felt her pull back like nothing had happened. Like it was nothing. And she didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on her plate and smiled at something Thad said. And I sat there with that small, deliberate pressure still alive in my fingers. And I thought, something is wrong. My name is Walter, and I know when something is wrong. I spent 22 years with the Ontario Provincial Police, the last 11 of them in financial crimes. I retired at 56, took a pension, and spent the next 8 years consulting for insurance companies and credit unions who needed someone who knew how fraud actually worked. Not the textbook version, but the real thing. The patient, intimate, personal kind. The kind where someone sits across a table from you, passes you the gravy, and smiles. Lorraine knew all of this about me. My daughter knew all of this about me. I think that's exactly why she squeezed my hand instead of saying a word. Her name is Abby. She's 31. She works in hospital administration in London, Ontario, about 2 hours down the 401 from where Lorraine and I have lived for the past 30 years. She's careful and measured and not given to panic. She gets that from her mother. She also has a stubborn streak and a tendency to size people up quietly before she commits to an opinion. She gets that from me. She'd been with Thad for about 4 months. She'd talked about him on the phone. Carefully, I noticed. Always carefully. And then one Sunday in late February, she brought him to the house for dinner. Lorraine made roast chicken and a butter tart for dessert, because Abby had mentioned offhandedly that it was his favorite. He arrived with a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a story about being stuck behind a snowplow on the 402. He was 40, maybe 42, tall, kept himself fit, dressed in that studied casual way that suggests money without announcing it. He said he was in private equity. He named a firm I'd never heard of based in Toronto. He mentioned the Muskoka cottage his family had owned since the 70s, like it was a small, unremarkable thing. Dinner was warm and easy, and Lorraine loved him, and I sat there trying to find the specific thing I didn't trust, the way I used to sit across interview tables from people and wait for the thread to pull. And then Abby squeezed my hand, and I had it. We were washing up after dessert. Lorraine was in the living room with Thad, and I could hear him talking about interest rates, the way men like him always talk about interest rates, with total confidence and just enough jargon to close off questions. Abby was drying a serving dish, and she said, very quietly, without looking up, "Did you like him?" I said, "I'm still thinking about it." She set the dish down on the counter. She picked up another one. "He's very successful," she said. "He's working on something big right now. A real estate development fund. Lots of investors." She paused. "He mentioned that you and Mum might be interested. At some point, no pressure." I didn't say anything. "He's not pushy about it," she added. "He just mentioned it." "How much?" I said. "He said the entry point is usually around 50,000, but he said for family. It's flexible." I kept washing the pot in my hand. The water was very hot and I didn't mind it. "How much have you put in?" I said. She was quiet for long enough that I had my answer before she gave it. 22,000, she said, back in January, before I brought him home. I set the pot down. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on the dish towel that's been hanging from the oven handle in that kitchen since 1997, and I said, "Okay." She finally looked at me. "Dad, I know," I said. "I don't know what I know," she said. "It might be nothing. He's shown me the prospectus. He has a real office. He has clients. I know. Met 2 of them," I said again. "But something," she said. "Yeah," I said. "Something." We went back into the living room, and I sat down and talked about hockey with Thad for 40 minutes, and when they left, I stood in the driveway in the February cold and watched his Audi disappear, and then I went inside and told Lorraine I was going to bed early. I lay in the dark for a long time. She didn't ask me what I was thinking. She's known me for 34 years. In the morning, I called a contact at the OSC, the Ontario Securities Commission, a woman I'd worked alongside on 3 cases in the 90s. She's retired now too, but she still knows people. I gave her the name of the firm Thad had mentioned and asked her to make some quiet inquiries. No rush, just curious. Then I called a friend at the credit union, where Lorraine and I have our RRSP and TFSA accounts, just to confirm nothing had been touched without our knowing. It hadn't. That was a relief and also, in a certain way, a useful piece of information. I did not tell Lorraine what I was doing. I told her I was going for a walk, and then I actually went for a walk, down the path along the river that runs behind our neighborhood, the one that's a muddy mess in March but by April turns beautiful. I walked for about an hour and thought through what I knew. Here is what I knew. Abby was not the kind of person who made careless decisions about money. She had an RRSP. She had a FHSA she'd been contributing to since the government introduced the account. She read the fine print. She called me before she signed her car loan at 24 to make sure the rate was reasonable. The fact that she had given $22,000 to a man she'd known for a few months before she'd introduced him to us, before she had any particular reason to trust him with that kind of money. That told me something. It told me either she'd been in love in a way that compromised her judgment, or she'd been managed, moved carefully into a position of trust, and then turned gently toward a commitment before she quite knew what she'd agreed to. I'd seen the second thing many times. It has a shape. It's not violent. It doesn't feel like fraud while it's happening. It feels like opportunity. It feels like being chosen. The OSC contact called me back 4 days later. The firm Thad had mentioned existed, technically. It was a numbered company registered in Ontario with a single director listed, a man whose name I didn't recognize. There were no disclosed registrants, no licensed advisors, no filings with the securities regulators that she could find. It's not nothing, she told me, but it's also not a real firm. If someone's using that name to solicit investments, they're doing it without any registration. That's illegal. I thanked her and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes. Then I called my daughter. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I told her I'd been thinking about the investment opportunity Thad had mentioned, and that Lorraine and I might be interested after all. I said I'd like to sit down with him and go through the prospectus properly. I said I had some specific questions about the fund structure. Abby was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, is that all right with you?" I said, "Yes," she said. "I think that's good." I could hear the relief in her voice, and I could also hear what the relief was covering, which was fear. She wanted someone else to look at it. She'd been living with a doubt she couldn't quite name for long enough, that she'd found a way to get me into the same room without saying it out loud. She was too far in to pull back on her own. She needed confirmation from someone she trusted absolutely. That's what the hand squeeze had been. We set up a meeting for the following Saturday at a coffee shop in London. Thad's suggestion, neutral ground, he said. Very relaxed. Just a conversation. I drove down the night before and stayed at Abby's apartment. We didn't talk about Thad. We watched a nature documentary about Arctic wolves, and Lorraine called at 9:30 to say goodnight. And I could tell from Abby's voice on the phone that she was grateful we were there, just present, just in the next room. She went to bed, and I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and went through the prospectus she'd left out on the counter for me. It was a good-looking document, 42 pages, professionally formatted, full of the right language. Projected returns of 12 to 15% annually. A residential development fund targeting secondary markets across Ontario and British Columbia. Risk disclosure section that was technically present but written to be skimmed. No auditor named. No independent trustee. The address for the registered office was a unit in a shared workspace building in downtown Toronto. The kind of address you rent for $90 a month, so you have something to put on a letterhead. I found 4 things that didn't hold together. I wrote them down on the back of an envelope because I didn't want them on my phone. And then I went to bed. The coffee shop was a small independent place near Victoria Park, the kind that's been there long enough to feel like a neighborhood institution. Thad was there when we arrived, already seated with his coat draped over the chair beside him and a flat white in front of him. He stood up and shook my hand with both of his and said, "Walter, great to finally do this properly," he said. Abby looked beautiful and she smiled in the careful way she'd been smiling at him since February, and I kept my face exactly as warm and open as it needed to be. I ordered a regular coffee. I took out the envelope. I said, I had some questions about the structure of the fund, if that's all right. He spread his hands. Absolutely. Of course. That's why we're here. I asked about the auditor first. He said they used an accounting firm, gave me a name, said they were based in Mississauga. I wrote the name down. I asked about the registered trustee. He explained that for a fund of this type, the trustee function was managed internally, which was standard practice for private placements. I nodded and wrote that down too. I asked about the specific projects the fund was currently holding. He named 3 municipalities, a development near Barrie, something in the Okanagan, a project outside Fredericton. I asked for the project addresses. He said he'd have to follow up with that detail in writing, for privacy reasons related to the other investors. I said that was fine. Then I said, I noticed the prospectus references Section 2.3 of the Ontario Securities Act in the risk disclosure, but the exemption you'd be relying on for an offering of this type would actually fall under National Instrument 45-106. I wasn't sure if that was a drafting oversight or something I was misreading. There was a pause. It lasted about 3 seconds. If you weren't watching for it, you would have missed it entirely. Thad smiled and said he'd have to check with their legal team on the specific regulatory citation because that was a little outside his area. Abby looked at her coffee cup. I said that was completely understandable and that I'd appreciate it if he could have someone follow up with both the project addresses and the regulatory clarification within the next few days before Lorraine and I made any decisions. He said absolutely, without question. He had our contact information from Abby. We shook hands again in the parking lot, and he drove away in the Audi, and Abby and I stood in the cold for a moment without speaking. She said, He didn't know what you were talking about. I said, No, he didn't. What's National Instrument 45-106? It's real, I said, but a fund manager who's actually licensed would have corrected me immediately, because the citation in the prospectus is the right one. I quoted the wrong one on purpose. She absorbed that. So he doesn't know the regulations. He knows enough to look like he knows. That's different. We walked to the car. I opened her door and then went around to mine, and we sat there for a moment with the heater running. The accounting firm he named, I said. I'll check it. The 3 projects. I'll see if there are any development applications in those municipalities that match what he described. And I want to pull the corporate registration for the fund again, properly this time, through a contact who can see more than I can. She said, and if it comes back the way you think it will, then we go to the OSC formally, and we talk to a lawyer. I already put in $22,000, Dad. I know, I said. We're going to try to get it back. She turned and looked out the window. It had started to snow, light and dry, the kind that doesn't accumulate but makes the air look full. I should have called you before I did it, she said. Yeah, I said, but you called me now. The accounting firm didn't exist. Not by that name, not at any address in Mississauga, not in the CPA Ontario registry. The name was close to a real firm. 1 letter different, same city, which is a specific technique. It relies on people not checking carefully. Most people don't. I called my OSC contact again, this time with more specifics. The numbered company, the director's name, the fund name as it appeared on the prospectus. She took it upstairs, as she put it. 2 days later, she called me back and said there was already an open file on the fund, that 2 other complaints had been filed in the previous 6 months, and that an investigator had been assigned, but hadn't yet had enough to move on. They have enough now, she told me. What do they need from my end? I said. A formal complaint, a copy of the prospectus, your daughter's transfer records if she's willing to provide them. I said she was willing. I didn't contact Thad directly. I didn't warn him. I've learned over 22 years and then another 8 that the moment a person like that feels the ground shift, they move. Money disappears. Accounts close. The numbered company dissolves and a new one appears somewhere else, and the whole thing starts again with a fresh list of names. I wanted him to stay exactly where he was, feeling exactly as confident as he'd felt in that coffee shop, right up until he couldn't anymore. It took 11 weeks. I heard about it not from the OSC but from Abby, who called me on a Tuesday evening in May and said, "It's on the news." I turned on CBC and there it was. A 41-year-old man from the GTA had been charged with fraud over $5,000 and with the illegal distribution of securities. He'd operated multiple funds under different names over a period of roughly 6 years, 37 investors. Total losses across all the funds, just under $2 million. He'd been very good at this. He always operated on personal referral. He targeted people who were established but not wealthy enough to have professional advisors, retirees, small business owners, people with a bit of money put aside, and a sense that the big returns were available to someone, just not usually to them. He made them feel chosen. He was patient. He never pushed. My daughter was one of the youngest investors they'd identified. Most were in their 50s and 60s. I sat in the living room and watched the report, and Lorraine put her hand on my arm. "You got him," she said. "The OSC got him," I said. "Walter, okay," I said. "Yeah." Abby flew up the following weekend. She sat in the kitchen with Lorraine and me, and we had a meal together that nobody made a big deal of, which is the right way to handle something in this family. We had leftover soup and good bread from the bakery on Cedar Street, and we talked about other things, mostly her job, the FHSA she was going to get back on track once this was sorted, whether we were going to open the cottage in June or wait until July. At some point, she said, "The investigator said the restitution process could take a while." "It usually does," I said. She said, "There's a chance I get some of it back. Not all of it. Some is better than none." She nodded. She was quiet for a minute, turning her mug in her hands the way she's done since she was about 16. Then "He was good, wasn't he? Like, actually good at it?" "Yes," I said. "I'm not an idiot." "No," I said, "you're not. And that's not how it works. The ones who are actually good at it, they don't look for idiots. They look for smart, trusting people. Smart people make better marks because they trust their own instincts, and by the time the instincts start flagging something, they've already committed and they don't want to believe it." She thought about that. "You flagged it," I said. "That matters. You found a way to tell me without saying it because you didn't trust yourself yet, but you trusted your instincts enough to do something. That's not nothing. That's a lot, actually." She looked at Lorraine and then back at me. "I just squeezed your hand," she said. "I know," I said, "and I heard you." The charges worked through the court system over the following months. I gave a statement. A few of the other investors gave statements. The case was not complicated, legally. The evidence was clean, and the investigator had done thorough work. He pleaded guilty in late autumn to 2 of the counts and received a sentence that included a significant fine, a period of house arrest, followed by 3 years of probation, and a permanent ban from acting as an investment dealer or advisor in any capacity. He will not be able to do this again. Not in Canada, not in this way. 37 families. Some of them lost savings they'd spent decades building. A retired teacher from Hamilton. A couple from Prince Edward Island who'd sold a small business. A man in his early 70s from Thunder Bay who'd been planning to use the money to help his grandchildren with university. I think about them sometimes. Not with guilt. I didn't do this to them, and there's no use in carrying guilt that belongs to someone else, but with the specific sober attention that this kind of thing deserves. Abby got back 11,000 of her 22. She called me the day the check arrived and said she was putting it straight back into her savings, and I said, "Good." And she said, "I know, Dad. I know." There's a path along the river near our house that I still walk most mornings from March to November. It passes through a stretch of old oak trees that go bright in October, the kind of orange that seems almost unreasonable, too much, like someone turned the saturation up. Lorraine walks it with me sometimes, on weekends when there's no rush. I don't think about Thad much anymore. He took up exactly as much space in my life as he deserved, and then the space closed. I think about my daughter, though, about the way she reached over in the middle of that dinner and pressed her hand into mine, and said everything that needed to be said without saying a word. About the particular kind of trust that takes. To believe that someone will understand without being told. To believe that the signal, however small, will be enough. I spent 30 years, professionally and then semi-professionally, looking for the thing people weren't saying. Listening for what was underneath the words. And I can tell you honestly that most people never fully believe anyone is truly listening. She believed it, and she was right. That's the part I'm proudest of. Not that I found the thread, not that I knew where to pull, but that when she reached for me, I was paying attention.